Welcome to the IISS this afternoon. For the benefit of our members worldwide who are viewing this event live over the internet, my name is Rahul Roy Chaudhary. I'm the Senior Fellow for South Asia at the Institute. Earlier this year, the IISS embarked on a substantive, high-quality, research-led project on Afghanistan towards 2015 and beyond. This includes a series of publications, conferences, discussion meetings, and media briefings on the domestic, political, economic, and security environment in Afghanistan, the handover of NATO ISAF Combat Command to Afghan forces by the end of the next year, and the withdrawal of combat forces by the end of the following year, as well as issues of reconciliation and reintegration with the Taliban and other Afghan insurgents. A key aspect of this project is the role of Afghanistan's neighbors and near neighbors, who become more important to stability and security during its transition phase. This has already resulted in a IISS Delphi book on Afghanistan, not surprisingly titled Afghanistan to 2015 and Beyond, which I would unhesitatingly recommend to all of you here. The next IISS South Asia Security Conference, which brings together senior Afghan, Pakistan, and Indian officials and experts, along with delegates from the US, UK, and Europe, takes place at the end of the month in Muscat in Oman. And we've also hosted several talks on Afghanistan by senior military and political leaders. As a near neighbor, India has a long-standing relationship with Afghanistan. A bilateral treaty of friendship took place in September 1950, and a year ago, Afghanistan's first strategic partnership agreement was signed with India. A week prior to Afghan President Hamid Karzai's visit to India, I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Ambassador Rakesh Sood, to talk about India's relations with Afghanistan past and future. Ambassador Sood is a senior diplomat from India who served as ambassador to Afghanistan from January 2005 to January 2008, and is currently ambassador of India to France. Please note that Ambassador Sood's formal remarks will be on the record, but the discussion and the Q&A session which follows will be off the record, at which time the video recording currently taking place will end. Ambassador Sood.
Thank you, Rahul. Let me first of all say what a pleasure it is to be here at IISS after a long gap. I think during the 90s, I was at IISS more than a couple of times. And in fact, when we started the dialogue, the first of these Muscat dialogues that you talked about in Dubai, one was there at the inception. As I was there at the inception when you started the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore. So, but I think the last 12 years, 10 or 12 years, I have not been back, so thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and inviting me here to speak on India and Afghanistan. Also, my thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. I need to make the usual disclaimer that what I'm saying I'm not reflecting the views of the government of India in that sense, but these are my own views about India, Afghanistan, past and future. I think, as you mentioned, we have a very long-standing historical and civilizational ties which have been driven by geography. Because if you look at the map of Afghanistan, you will find that the Hindu Kush mountain sort of goes in from north and comes down towards the south, then petering out into the desert areas. And the Hindu Kush mountain was a natural kind of a frontier which defined what was the Indian subcontinental space, or the South Asian subcontinental space, at least on the western side. And this, you find references, or there are so many evidences of these historical ties, of these civilizational ties between India and Afghanistan, the fact that Afghanistan that time was always a country which was on the crossroads of empires. So you had the South Asian or the Indian subcontinent and the empires, whichever empires were ruling on the Indian subcontinent. Towards the north, you had the Russian Empire, and towards the west, you had the Persian Empire. And in fact, the Hindu Kush Mountains formed a kind of a cleavage on these. And so on both sides, there was a natural interest on the part of the competing empires to try and create their spheres of influence. As far as the Indian subcontinent was concerned, it was the Silk Route, which passed through Afghanistan. You heard about how Buddhism traveled. I mean, if you look at it, Buddha was born in Lumbini, which is in Nepal, very close to the India-Nepal border. And you would have thought that it could have traveled straight north upwards into Tibet and so on, and then into China, but it didn't. It went westwards through Gandhara and through Bamiyan, and then up through Central Asia into Tibet. So it's a complicated route, but that shows you the salience of the crossroads of civilization that I was referring to earlier. Now, during the British period, during the period of the British Empire, the notion of crossroads became much more a notion of competing spheres of influence. And that's when a formal boundary called the Durand Line was developed in 1893. The Durand Line was never formally accepted as a boundary, and in fact, even recently I remember reading some articles, by the Afghans, that is. For the British, it was a boundary of the British Empire. But the Afghans always felt that it was more a kind of a line defining suzerainty rather than a frontier defining the limits of a sovereign state. Because the Afghan problem was they felt that this was an arbitrary line which divided the Pashtun heartlands into two parts for no reason, except that it suited the British Empire in terms of what Lord Curzon talked about as a triple frontier theory, that you had one frontier of the empire, namely the colony that they were ruling India at that time. So you had one frontier. Within that frontier, you had two zones, one being the federally administered tribal areas where the frontier criminal regulations operated, which still happens today in what is called FATA in Pakistan. And then you had another country which was ostensibly neutral, but one which was where the British had an enormous amount of influence by having a political agent there who could advise the local king on the military and political and diplomatic affairs of that ostensibly neutral country. This was Curzon's thing, which was, it evolved out of what had been forward policy of the British Empire and then a more conservative policy, and it evolved out of the Afghan wars. In fact, you find a similar policy applied in the case of Nepal in 1816, where Nepal was never conquered by the British, but a political agent was imposed there in 1816 after the Treaty of Sugoli to advise the Nepalese king on foreign and military affairs. So, but anyway, so this is how, but the Afghans never accepted the frontier notion of the Durand Line. And in 1947, when India became independent, Pakistan was created, there was this issue sort of erupted again. And a little historical factoid, which I don't know how many of you know, but when Pakistan applied for membership to the UN General Assembly after becoming independent, there was one country that voted against its membership, saying that it does not have internationally recognized frontiers, and that was Afghanistan, on account of the fact that they did not agree to the Durand Line, which had been done in 1893. So, I mean, if there are many other reasons for the trust deficit between Pakistan and Afghanistan, But if you start looking at historical manifestations, I think that this would always stand out as one of the first. I would say that from that time onwards, I mean, the Indian relationship with Afghanistan, or the Indian subcontinent relationship with Afghanistan, had been an extremely positive relationship, much more so with the Pashtun communities, which is also reflected in Indian films and Indian literature and so on. And the image of the Pashtun has always been a positive, reliable, a positive image, an image of somebody who's reliable, who's loyal, who's fierce, etc., etc. Other linkages include the very famous linkage of the Awami leader Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was also popularly known as the Frontier Gandhi because he's a huge, towering personality. And he decided to adopt Gandhi's approach of non-violence during the freedom movement, thereby earning the name of the Frontier Gandhi. So these were some of the things, and so this is the kind of relationship or civilizational relationship that existed between India and Afghanistan at the time, before independence, before 1947. Now, a lot of this translated into enormous goodwill post-1947, even though India and Afghanistan no longer shared a boundary. 1979 obviously is a watershed, and that started changing the relationship. Pakistan took a certain line in terms of, or Pakistan had actually taken that line even earlier, because 1973, when Zahir Shah was overthrown in Afghanistan and Sardar Daud replaced him, although he was his cousin, Sardar Daud was left, the party was PDPA, and even between 73 and 79, you had the Pakistani intelligence community supporting the creation of groups. It was at that time not called Mujahideen, but groups who to go against the PDPA-led government of Sardar Daud. And in fact, it was Nasrullah Babar who at that time, who subsequently became Interior Minister and was then Interior Minister in the 90s, when at the time of the creation of into being of the Taliban. India, 1979, took a different view. We were much more comfortable with the PDPA regime, and we continue to support and have diplomatic relations with the PDPA regime in Afghanistan. I think this is much more recent history with which I'm sure all of you are familiar. And then we come to the 1989, the Soviet withdrawal, and then 89 to 92, a period when everybody expected that Najibullah would fall within a matter of weeks, but then he survived till 1992. And in my view, he survived till 1992 because, A, of the infighting within the Mujahideen leaders, and B, because he continued to receive a certain amount of external support from Soviet Union and then subsequently from Russia. But by 1992, it was very difficult, and in 1992, the Najibullah regime collapsed, leading to the coming into being of the Mujahideen governments, which in turn from about 1994 onwards created a civil war between competing Mujahideen leaders, and from about 1996 onwards, the emergence of the Taliban on the Afghan stage. By 1996, India had closed its embassy in Kabul. And so from 1996 till 2001, we did not have an embassy in Kabul. Now, this is 1996 to 2001 was also the time that there emerged a northern alliance consisting essentially of non-Pashtuns, largely Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, and so on, uh, which resisted the advances of the Taliban. And India, Russia, and Iran found themselves on the same side in terms of providing support to the Northern Alliance. In fact, we ran the hospital on the Afghan-Tajik border at Farkar, where Ahmad Shah Massoud was brought when he died in the suicide bomb attack 2 days before 9/11. This was interesting because traditionally India's closest relationship in the Afghan ethnic community had always been with the Pashtuns. But somehow, even though we had developed certain linkages with some of the Mujahideen, but with the Taliban we had absolutely no equities whatsoever. And and traditionally we had less of a contact with the non-Pashtun communities, because the non-Pashtun communities like the Tajiks and so on are Farsi speaking, and they were closer in that sense to the Iranian sphere. But during 1996 to 2001, we developed close links with Ahmad Shah Massoud and a whole host of other leaders, Ismail Khan and so on. Post 2001, it became, the situation completely changed. India went back, reopened its embassy, and started, I think, what is perhaps the largest economic assistance program that we have in our neighborhood. And today it stands at something like $2 billion. And I think it is there are two aspects to it which I'd just like to highlight. One aspect is that India is not a traditional aid donor country, so we do not have an aid development agency or anything like that. So when we started assisting Afghanistan in post-2001, it was virtually every cent that was committed, every dollar that was pledged, committed, was actually disbursed as a dollar on the ground. I don't know how many of you are familiar with how aid programs work. I learned it when I served in Kabul. I learned that there is a notion called a pledge, which is relatively open-ended in terms of time frames. Then there is a notion called a commitment. And then there is a notion called a program, which goes through the consultancy phase, and then ultimately the implementation. By the time we get to the implementation, about anything up to 82% of the original pledge is actually over. And so in that sense, when I say $2 billion, I mean $2 billion on the ground. Because the administration overheads of the $2 billion that India has pledged, committed, and delivered, it does not contain even a cent of administration overheads. Now that's a huge difference, which means that if this was the same delivery that was being done through, say, other aid agencies, the amount would have been something like $8 to $10 billion. The second aspect of India's assistance cooperation program in Afghanistan is the enormous scale and diversity of it. I mean, if you look at the humanitarian side of it, the kind of humanitarian assistance, we've run disability camps, we've provided large amounts of winter clothing, we run health missions, 5 health missions, doctors providing free medicines. And we have upgraded what used to be one of the best pediatric hospitals in Afghanistan, and today is certainly one of the finest, the Indira Gandhi Institute of Child Health. It had been set up long ago, it had fallen obviously into disuse, and now it has been upgraded. There are doctors there, lifts have been installed, operation theaters have been put on, etc., etc. In addition, to assist children going to school, we announced a commitment of 1 million tons of wheat which is converted into high-protein enriched biscuits, and 100 grams of biscuits are given to school children. About 1.5 million school kids in primary school all over the country receive 100 grams of biscuits, these high-protein biscuits, administered through the World Food Program. I have traveled in remote places in Afghanistan, Badakhshan, for example, which is at the edge of the Wakhan corridor, and went to see how this program was doing, and went into the school and asked some of the kids, and they said they come to the school because they get the biscuits. In fact, but some of them, they don't eat the biscuits. They are supposed to take it home so that they can share it with their other brothers and sisters. I mean, it has become, because Badakhshan particularly is a very remote area. But the point I'm trying to make is that this little item of food is seen as something which is important in some of the very poor and very remote areas, because the biscuits are high protein enriched and all the rest of it. If we look at the power sector, when I went to Afghanistan, Kabul was in really, really bad shape in terms of power supply. The big project was the 220 kV line that India built, connecting Kabul to the Central Asian power systems. And it is because of that that today, and the line goes through over the Salang tunnel. And that is one of the big challenges that we had, that to take this power transmission line over an altitude of 15,000 feet. We've done other setup in Faryab province near the Turkmen border, again transformers, power distribution systems, etc., etc. We've done rainwater harvesting projects and solar electrification in 100 villages in rural areas. Remote villages which we knew that would never get a connection to the main transmission lines because it was too costly. So these villages, in order to be self-sufficient, are best served by setting up, solar power systems. And this is something that I'd like to say. Some of these projects that we did are projects which we thought the community, the international community around us should take up and replicate, because the rainwater harvesting, for example, or solar electrification in remote villages. Now, we took Afghan men and women to India, trained them. They're called barefoot solar engineers. So they go back to the village, and actually what they do is they set up a little shop or, in the village. They have a little stock of spares, and they service the solar panels. So everybody knows, and they charge a small fee for it. So what it starts doing is it makes them self-employed entrepreneurs. And we found that there are women. We have now trained a number of Afghan women as these barefoot solar engineers. And these are inexpensive projects relatively. But anyway, I'll come to that. If you look at connectivity-related projects, we've built roads, including the major road from Zaranj to Delaram, which is about 214 kilometers. We provided telecom facilities connecting 11 provinces in Afghanistan to Kabul. We put up the TV uplink from Kabul and downlink in all the provincial capitals of Kabul. We provided printing presses to the Azadi Publishing Printing House in Kabul for newspapers, magazines, etc. Right at the very beginning, we had given 3 Airbus aircraft to the national airline, and so on. Infrastructure, which people talk about, we built one of the first cold storages in Kandahar, a 5,000-ton cold storage. Again, a project which I think can easily be replicated in other areas, because, Afghanistan has traditionally, in my view, one of the reasons, perhaps not the only reason, is that agriculture has not been able to take the kind of roots in Afghanistan as we would have liked to see, is lack of facilities in terms of its marketing. Where do they go? Where does the farmer go and sell it? So if he can't, then the return he's going to get on it is going to be an abysmally low return. We are doing the Salma Dam in western Afghanistan. We set up the tool room facility in an industrial estate at Pule Charkhi, just on the outskirts of Kabul. For Kabul municipality, we provided trucks, for removal of sewage, etc., a couple of hundred of them. For the National Transport Company, we provided buses, something like about 700-800 of them. So there is an enormous amount of work in terms of infrastructure that has been done. In capacity building, I think this is one of the most fundamental, because everybody who's been to Afghanistan or who has dealt with Afghanistan realizes that capacity building and formation, that is a key. We have 675 Afghans. This started, in fact, it's a very interesting conversation, which took place in 2005 when Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh visited Kabul. During this conversation with President Karzai, and President Karzai said, President Karzai himself has studied in India. He studied political science in Himachal Pradesh, did his postgraduate. So he told Dr. Manmohan Singh that we need more scholarships to send students to India. And at that time, so the Prime Minister turned to me and he asked me, he said, so how many scholarships do we have currently? And so I said, so currently we have something like about 14 scholarships from one agency and another 4 from another agency in India. Multiple, Ministry of Education, Indian Council for Cultural Relations, and so on. So Dr. Manmohan Singh turned to President Karzai and said, and Mr. President, how many scholarships do you think you would like? And President Karzai said, oh, 1,000. So it gives you an idea. And for a moment, sort of everybody was silent, and then Dr. Manmohan Singh turned back to him and said, Mr. President, let's do it like this. We'll make it 500 scholarships, because these scholarships are for long-term courses. It will take 3 years to do a BA degree, or or 5 years to do an engineering degree or a postgraduate degree. And we will compensate with these 500 an additional 500 short-term professional training courses ranging 3 months to 9 months. And became a huge thing. And this happened in 2005. So we started implementing it in 2006. Today the number is 675 and 675, which is huge. And this is just over and above the other training courses that we have run, which are tailor-made for Afghan parliamentarians, for Afghan diplomats, for Afghan journalists, for remote sensing, for computer training, and so on. In addition, we've set up a vocational training center for skill building in Kabul with the help of the Confederation of Indian Industry, which is the equivalent of the CBI here in UK. We've set up, with the help of a very well-known women's NGO called SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association. With their help, we've set up a vocational training center for women in what used to be called Bagh-e-Zanana. It's still called Bagh-e-Zanana, which used to be a park for women. So now what we've done there is set up a women's vocational training center with its own outlets, and the women feel completely secure, safe there. They go with their kids, they work there, they run the shops. The shops all face outside. And they're able to sell their jams and preserves and their embroidery or whatever else they produce in that vocational training center where the skilling is done outside to the rest of the community. The last part of the assistance program that we've done, which was started in 2008, was the Small Development Projects Initiative, where the projects are implemented by the local community in order to give them a stake. And there are about 100 of them going on right now. And these cover things like primary schools, health centers, drinking water supply projects, small roads, connecting roads, small bridges, because kids won't go to school if you expect them to walk for 10 kilometers or 12 kilometers or something like that. So just a small bridge which saves them a 6-kilometer, 8-kilometer walk. Now, this is the kind of thing which I went through this merely not just to give you an idea of the amount of money that has gone into it. Oh, I missed out the Afghan parliament. Sorry. We are also building the Afghan parliament, which I think is one of the most ambitious and beautiful building. We rebuilt the Habibia school, which is the oldest first school, public school that was set up in 1903 in Kabul, which had been bombed and destroyed. So we rebuilt that and so on. But the parliament, I think, is going to be one of the most prestigious things that we're doing. So there is a huge, huge amount, but it is, what I did was I tried to explain to you the multidimensionality of the kind of work that we are doing there, which brings me to my next point. Why are we doing all this? Because I think that there is a certain kind of a vision for Afghanistan that India has, and I'll share that with you. And I leave it to you to decide as to how you want to, how that vision squares with whatever vision you have, irrespective of which part of the world you come from. And the vision of Afghanistan that we have is an Afghanistan, first of all, that is united, which has territorial integrity, its territory is secure, and Afghanistan, because of the plural nature of its multi-ethnic society, and Afghanistan that has its own form of democracy which enables all its multi-ethnicity to coexist and co-prosper together, an Afghanistan that is secure, an Afghanistan that is stable, an Afghanistan that does not cause concern either in the region around it or further afield, and an Afghanistan where its population gets educated and is able to prosper, to make use of its natural resources, to make use of its potential of being at the crossroads of today, a whole different dynamic in economic terms. But that is the kind of a vision of Afghanistan that India has. And it is because of this kind of a vision of Afghanistan which explains the diversity of the assistance programs that we have undertaken. Now, we see all these talks about, the reconciliation and negotiations with the Taliban and so on, and a lot of times people ask us as to what is India's view on all of this. And we have a very straightforward view on this, that yes, Afghanistan is for the Afghans. The process of reconciliation has to be Afghan-led and Afghan-driven. And the Afghans have to determine what kind of a society they would like to have. And the Afghan constitution spells out a vision of Afghanistan which is very much in sync with the kind of vision that I have spelled out for you in terms of the vision that India has for Afghanistan. And therefore, it is, if the Afghans are able to come together, whether we call them red lines, as has been called at different times by different political leaders in the West, or whether we call them preconditions, or whether we call them outcomes, should they accept the Afghan constitution, renouncing of violence, giving up linkages with extremist groups, etc., etc. I think these are matters of detail which the Afghans have to resolve themselves in terms of their own reconciliation process. And because a durable peace requires a shared vision, it requires a shared ownership of the process, and it requires shared stakes, which means some kind of a power sharing. That is the way we can get a durable peace in Afghanistan, and we would support, India will support a process which can create a durable peace for a stable and a secure Afghanistan as I spelt out. 2014, I think too much attention has been focused on just the security transition. Well, because international community is hugely involved in the security transition. And I think the public mood or public patience in the Western world for continuing with large-scale security presence in Afghanistan is running out. But there are two other transitions which will also take place. One is the political transition, and we have just seen the announcement, dates being announced by the Election Commission that the new presidential election will take place in 5th of April, if I remember right, in 2014. Now, that is a hugely important political transition. And how smoothly it goes, how, who will be the new leader, and it's very difficult at this stage to make any predictions on that count. But I think the great achievement of President Karzai is that he became the face of Afghanistan, number one. Number two, I think it is a huge achievement that he helped pull the country together. And I think when history is written, I think his most significant achievement would be that he united the country, as it were, in its most critical period of formation after 2001. The third transition, as I said, is going to be an economic transition, because we have seen the outcomes of the Chicago summit, the Chicago NATO summit, and the Tokyo summit. The commitments that have been made, the financial commitments that have been made, I think are much smaller and will lead to a shrinking of the economy, actually. Even if these commitments are made good upon, which we don't know yet, that's in the future. But it will still lead to a shrinking of the economy because there is actually a much larger economy which is taking place right now. And so therefore, from about something like, here I'm also talking about the parallel economy, and which exists, but I think what we are going to see is a shrinking also in terms of the parallel economy, because so much of the international community will leave Afghanistan that we will see a shrinking of the economy unless there is private investment or other international foreign investment which goes in to make up for the slack. And this is one of the reasons why this year in June, India hosted the first Afghan investment conference, where we called in private sector, not just Indian private sector, but also from the region, from countries around us, and from Afghanistan, and the international agencies like World Bank and IFC, to see how we could look at smoothing the way. So I think 2014 is certainly going to be critical, because it is not just one transition, but three transitions that Afghanistan has to negotiate successfully in order to be able to achieve the kind of vision that it has set itself out for.
Thank you.